At a castle in the mountains of Hungary. Her family sent her here to learn courtly manners, the skills a young woman needs to marry well and serve a noble household. For a peasant family, this is the opportunity of a lifetime. The castle is beautiful. The countess herself is gracious, well-spoken, from one of the most powerful families in all of Europe. Everything looks exactly as it should. She walks through the gates, the doors close behind her, and she never walks out again. Her name is lost to history. She's one of hundreds, maybe more. Nobody kept count of the peasant girls who disappeared into that castle. The woman who owned that castle would become known as the most prolific female serial killer in recorded history. Her name was Elizabeth Báthory, and this story is worse than any horror movie, because every detail comes from the testimony of people who were actually there. Before we enter that castle, drop a comment with your city and country, because once you see what the Blood Countess did behind those walls, you'll understand why they sealed her alive inside her own castle. Elizabeth Báthory was not born into the kind of family that produces monsters. She was born into the kind of family that produces kings. Her uncle was the King of Poland. Her cousin was the Prince of Transylvania. Cardinals, knights, judges, military commanders. The Báthory name was stamped across the power structure of Eastern Europe for generations. This wasn't just a noble family. This was the family, the one everyone else bowed to. But the family has a darker side. Relatives with reputations for cruelty, for instability, for the kind of behavior that other nobles whispered about behind closed doors. Elizabeth had an aunt named Carla, who, according to some accounts, enjoyed tormenting servants the way other women enjoyed embroidery. And some say Carla was the one who first showed young Elizabeth that hurting people wasn't just acceptable in their world. It was entertainment. At 15, Elizabeth was married off to a man named Ferenc Nadasdy. Political match. Two powerful families merging their bloodlines. Nadasdy was a soldier, a warrior, the kind of man who earned his nickname on the battlefield. They called him the Black Hungarian because of what he did to the Ottoman Turks. Something darker, something that crossed the line from correcting a servant into enjoying their suffering. But Nadasdy was almost never home. The Ottoman wars kept him on the frontier for months, sometimes years. And while he was gone, Elizabeth was alone, running the castle, commanding the servants, answering to absolutely no one. The first reports start during these years. Beatings that go too far, punishments that don't match the offense, girls who arrive at the castle healthy and leave broken, or don't leave at all. But nobody investigates, because she's a Báthory, and Báthory's answer to no one. Then in 1604, Nadasdy dies. Battle wound gone bad, or a prostitute's revenge, depending on who you believe. Either way, the Black Hungarian is gone, and whatever thin leash might have existed on Elizabeth's behavior snaps completely. She's in her 40s now, a wealthy widow, vast estates, multiple castles, no husband, no father, no authority above her except a distant king who has bigger problems to worry about. She has money, power, privacy, and whatever darkness has been growing inside her for 20 years now has nothing standing in its way. And this is when she builds her team, not servants, partners, people who don't just follow orders but enjoy the work. Ilona Jo, Elizabeth's childhood nurse, been with her since birth, testified later that she personally killed about 50 girls. 50. Dorothea Sentes, they called her Dorko, an older woman with a reputation for cruelty that matched the Countess herself. She carried out some of the worst acts, the things that required steady hands and no conscience. Janos Ujvari, a teenage boy they called Fichko. He handled the physical side of what was happening, the heavy work behind the scenes when things had to be taken care of. And Anna Darvulia, the one some called a witch, Elizabeth's closest companion, her confidant, her mentor, according to some accounts. The woman who didn't just help Elizabeth carry it out, but helped her refine it, taught her new methods, encouraged her to push further, to experiment. These weren't reluctant accomplices. According to the trial records, they were enthusiastic. They helped choose victims. They helped plan what would be done. They helped bury bodies in church graveyards at night, chanting over the graves. And the victims kept arriving. Young girls, peasant daughters, families sending their children to the castle hoping for a better life. Girls who walked through those gates expecting to learn needlework and found themselves in a nightmare that nobody would believe even if they survived long enough to tell it. Because who would believe a peasant girl accusing the most powerful woman in Hungary? Nobody. And Elizabeth knew it. What she did to those girls, according to more than 300 witnesses who testified during the investigation, goes beyond anything you've seen in a horror film, because horror films have limits. Elizabeth Báthory did not. It started with beatings, not the kind of slap a mistress gives a clumsy servant. Savage, prolonged, systematic beatings. Girls struck so many times they were left severely injured. One witness later described a single incident that seemed to go on endlessly. But the beatings were just the door, the entrance to something much worse. Elizabeth loved needles. She would use them on her victims, one by one, slowly, watching the face, reading the pain. She would press them into different parts of the body, especially where the nerves are most sensitive, making each movement as painful as possible. Ilona Joe testified that sometimes Elizabeth used so many needles on a girl that she looked like a hedgehog. That's not my metaphor. That's the testimony of a woman who was there. Then came the scissors. The injuries became more deliberate, more precise. She wasn't just hurting these girls. She was erasing them, taking away the parts of themselves they'd recognize in a mirror. As if the pain wasn't enough, she needed to destroy who they were. And the biting. This shows up in testimony after testimony, too consistent to dismiss. Elizabeth would bite her victims, not in a symbolic or restrained way, but with clear intent to cause harm. According to some accounts, these acts went far beyond what witnesses could fully describe, leaving even those present deeply disturbed. Then, the burning. According to testimony, heated objects were used against the body in ways meant to cause intense pain. Ilona Joe described how items were heated until they glowed and then pressed against the skin, held there as the suffering continued, and the room filled with fire. Wasn't enough. There was ice. In the dead of Hungarian winter, girls were dragged outside and left in the freezing cold. Water was poured over them again and again, exposing them to the elements for extended periods. They were left standing in the snow, unable to escape, while Elizabeth watched from a warm window inside. Some were covered in honey and left outside for insects, ants, bees, whatever came, their screams carrying across the empty countryside where nobody lived close enough to hear, and nobody would have come if they did. One account describes a girl forced to prepare and consume parts of her own body. The testimony doesn't give many details. It doesn't need to. Some sentences are horrifying enough on their own, and through all of it, Elizabeth showed nothing. No hesitation, no distress, no recognition that these were human beings. Even when she was sick, bedridden, too ill to stand, she had girls brought to her bed so she could strike and hurt them while she lay there. She couldn't stop. Whatever was driving this had no off switch. The blood was everywhere. So much of it from the violence that servants spread ashes around Elizabeth's bed to deal with it. They changed her clothes multiple times a day because they wouldn't stay clean for long. The walls of her chamber had to be scrubbed constantly. The castle carried a heavy metallic smell, and everyone who lived there knew exactly why. And this brings us to the legend, the story that made Elizabeth Báthory immortal in the worst possible way. According to the most famous account, it started with an accident. A servant girl brushing Elizabeth's hair pulled too hard and tore out a few strands. Elizabeth hit her so hard that blood ran from the girl's nose onto the countess's hand. Elizabeth looked at her skin where the blood had landed, and she thought the skin looked younger, smoother, more alive. From that moment, according to the legend, Elizabeth began bathing in the blood of young girls, having them killed and their blood collected, immersing herself in it, believing that their youth could be absorbed through their blood. Did this literally happen? The blood-bathing story first appeared in print in 1729, more than 100 years after her death. The original trial testimony never mentions it, but here's what matters. The people who lived in her castle, the people who dealt with the aftermath and heard the suffering for 20 years, they believed she was capable of it. The things they had actually witnessed were so extreme that bathing in blood didn't even sound like an exaggeration. That tells you everything you need to know about who this woman was. And for decades, nobody stopped her, because the girls who died were peasants. Their families had no power, no voice, no access to courts or kings. A noblewoman killing servants in 16th century Hungary was barely a scandal. It was a private matter, something that happened behind castle walls and stayed there, until Elizabeth made one mistake.